Well, good morning. Merry Christmas. Man, it's getting really close now. Just a few more days, 5 days. Don't you get so excited as Christmas gets up? Remember when you were a kid, you got more excited maybe. But, I can tell you when I was younger, and I have told you before if you've been here, but I would just get so excited. And even into my early adult years, because I'm so much more mature now, but I would just couldn't wait, because I had my heart set on something and I was sure, it was coming. And I remember it didn't take Kathy long after we were married to realize that she had to hide my gift like away from the house, like in a friend's home. And I remember one time we were heading from Conroe into Houston to head my mom's house on Christmas Eve. And so we had to stop at this friend's house to pick up the gift. So Kathy said, okay, wait here in the car. And so I hear the trunk open and, she puts the gift in there. So now I know the gift's on. It's with me. It's with me. And we're heading, we've got about, 40-mile drive into Houston. And so I start talking to her. I said, Dawn, listen, I know what you got me. I want to just go ahead and open it. And I had asked for this 5-volume set of, it's called Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia Dictionary. It's short for ZPAD. And I said, I'd asked for this volume of books. And I said, man, I just want to talk. I want to hold them. I want to hold them in my hand. I want to look at them. We've got 40 miles, like I can explore. And she's saying, no, you can wait. And I wouldn't say I pressured her, but I was persistent. And I said, you're not going to deny a man who wants to study the Bible. Like, it's part of Bible study, like right here. And sure enough, before we got out of the subdivision where this guy lived, she let me get it. I opened the trunk, get the package out, opened it up, looked at him. Isn't that terrible? Like, first service really kind of like gave me really mean and dirty, angry kind of looks. I guess because their kids were in there. But anyway, so I'm really bad about, that, though I have matured considerably now. Kathy doesn't even get me a gift anymore now. But, there is great anticipation, and a lot of us can relate to that. Our second son, Ben, I may have told you before, he was like his dad. He would get so excited when he was really little that every Christmas Eve, every Christmas Eve, especially we were driving from Austin down to Houston for Christmas, and he would be so worked up that when we finally arrived, without a doubt, he would just throw up. His nerves it is just excitement. Like people get excited about this thing we call Christmas and all of this thing. So, I want you to think about, for Jesus, that first Christmas, what kind of anticipation, what was it like for God who becomes a man? Like sometimes, we kind of move over that too quick. Like what was involved in that? I appreciate what Philip Yancey does in his book, The Jesus I Never Knew. He writes about this, and listen to what he says. He says, before Jesus, almost no pagan author had used humble as a compliment. Yet the events of Christmas point inescapably to what seems like an oxymoron, a humble God. The God who came to earth came not in a raging whirlwind, not in a devouring fire. Unimaginably, the maker of all things shrank down, so small as to become an ovum, a single fertilized egg barely visible to the naked eye, an egg that would divide and redivide until a fetus took shape, enlarging cell by cell inside a nervous teenager. Immensity cloistered in thy dear womb, marveled the poet John Donne. He made himself nothing. He humbled himself, said the Apostle Paul more prosaically. Fascinating to think about. Yancey goes on in this chapter, and he's basically talking about one day being in this beautiful theater in London, and he's listening to a presentation of Handel's Messiah. And he happens to look up to the royal box where the Queen is sitting, and others in her family. And he said that it reminded him of all the, kind of what's it like to kind of be royalty and all the trappings around that. And she had her bodyguards are up there, and and there's all the fanfare, and there's the bright clothing, and the jewelry, and all of the assistants, and the entourage. And it just made him think about the incredible contrast between the way rulers and dignitaries travel in our world and the way that God entered the world. In fact, he said not very long ago at the time of the writing, he basically said, that Queen Elizabeth had visited the United States recently, and that the reporters would just kind of obsess on all the logistics involved and how much stuff she would bring. In fact, here's a little bit of the inventory. It said that she brought 4,000 pounds of luggage. 4,000 pounds of luggage. Like when I tell Kathy, I say, hey, look, doll, I think we could just, travel light on this trip. And it's always significant. Well, better not go more there. She doesn't do 4,000 pounds, but here's the queen, 4,000 pounds of luggage, 2 outfits for every occasion. Now, make sure you catch that. It's not 2 outfits per day, which, for some of you ladies, you're thinking that's what, 2 outfits per occasion, several occasions per day. Like, that's a lot. Some of you guys don't change clothes, for a whole week. You wear pretty much the same thing. You sometimes you even sleep in those clothes. And then, she had one morning outfit because, someone might die who's important while she's here. And then she has 40 pints of her own plasma in case she's almost ready to die. And then she would bring her own hairdresser, 2 valets, a host of other attendants. I mean, basically, Yancey finishes up by saying, it wouldn't be uncommon for royal and rulers, dignitaries to travel to a foreign country and spend close to $20 million. Now, in contrast to that, is God, the maker of all things, who becomes a man, fully God, fully man, makes his way to planet Earth. He's born in a shelter for animals. There are probably more animal witnesses to what takes place than there are human witnesses. He doesn't really have a place to lay his head, so he's placed in this trough, and there with some hay, and they kind of get through the night. And it's about as stark a contrast as you can imagine. Paul says it this way, speaking of this event. He says, Jesus, though rich, all the glories of riches of glory of heaven. Jesus, though rich, became poor, so that we who are poor might become rich. And Paul used that description of that event to motivate the Corinthian readers to consider making a gift to help the poor back in Jerusalem. Corinthians are in present-day Greece, a place called Achaia. And he's motivating them to consider making a financial gift to help the poor. And he appeals to Christmas morning, the incarnation, God becoming a man. It's fascinating. And so for the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at 2 very important chapters in Scripture. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 2 Corinthians chapter 9. In fact, we begin chapter 9 today, if you want to turn there with me. And I hope you have your Bible or whatever you're going to scroll into. But I get to chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, and we pick up with chapter 9 as Paul continues trying to move the Corinthians to follow through on a commitment they made to give toward the poor in Jerusalem, appealing to Christmas, and to basically motivated by what Jesus gave us at Christmas and also what Jesus modeled to follow after that. Thus, the title to the series, Regifting Christmas. And so as you come to chapter 9, let me just kind of preview before I read this. Basically, he's going to talk about some of the benefits that actually come to the person who gives. There's obviously some benefits to those who are on the receiving end, but those on the giving end also have benefit as well. In fact, the first thing he's going to talk about is the influence that people have on others when they give cheerfully. We influence other people. The second thing he's going to talk about is investment. That when a person gives, modeled after Christmas, when we regift, when we give, that we actually make an investment and there's a return on your investment. There's an ROI. And there's some things he wants to kind of develop there, the return on our investment. And then finally, the third thing is he's actually going to talk about inventory. Like out of what resources do we have that we can give? And he's going to talk about inventory. So you can kind of look for these things as I read through this passage. We're looking at 11 verses, chapter 9, 2 Corinthians. So now it is superfluous for me. Superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me, and they find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, He has distributed freely, He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. Now we'll stop right there, finish up next week. Incredible passage. He begins first with this idea of the influence that we have on each other, on other people, when we have a heart that's generous, a heart that gives, a heart that regifts. And we see it represented here. In fact, the first thing I would say here in our point is that we see the appeal of zeal. The appeal of zeal. You remember the context here, if you've been with us, if you're new, you need to understand that what's happened is that the poor in Jerusalem, because of famine and persecution, that these churches over on the northern tip of the Mediterranean, and especially these areas of Achaia and Macedonia, like they're hearing about this, and Paul's collecting money to relieve the poor. And so a year ago, the Corinthians made a commitment. They were like jazzed about this. They're saying, "Oh man, like yeah, we want to help, and we're gonna gather a collection, and we're gonna make this thing happen." And so Paul then traveled north. So he's up in the areas of Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea, some of these places you read about in Acts and letters that are written to them in the New Testament. And these churches they hear about what Corinth is doing, and they think, "Man, we want in on that," because it says that the zeal of the Corinthians. Do you see that at the end of verse 2? He says, "And your zeal has stirred up most of them." It's amazing the influence that we can have on others by our generosity. And so he talks about that, the appeal of their zeal. Like, man, when we told others the story of what y'all were doing, they wanted in on it, they got in on it. And now what Paul does is he flips it. He says, now the Macedonians who were encouraged by your zeal, now I want to use their zeal to encourage you, Corinthians, to follow through with what you said you're going to do. And so what happens here is like Paul, he talks about how I've been boasting on you, talking and bragging on you guys, like your excitement, your commitment to this. He says, don't turn my boasting into roasting. Don't turn my boast into a roast where I'm going to basically be stood up. Like we get down there and like you guys haven't gathered the money. It's not ready to be collected. And all of a sudden, these guys that I bring with me from Macedonia, they're going to turn to me and go, "I thought you said like they were all jazzed about this. I thought you said that like they were making this big gift." And I'm like, what? And Paul says, believe it or not, like he says, like, man, make sure you guys have the gift ready, lest I be humiliated, to say nothing of you for being so confident. And so Paul is saying, like, man, I'm sending these guys ahead of me, Titus and those two brothers we talked about last week. I'm sending ahead so you guys will be ready. Now, let me ask you the question here. Like, Paul's talking, and like, does this feel like manipulation to you or motivation? You know, there's a difference, right? It feels like, man, Paul's really like turning the screws here a little bit. And I would suggest that the difference between manipulation and motivation is that motivation, you're trying to move people to do something for their good or for the good of others. Manipulation is when you try to get people to do something for your own personal good, that you benefit, that you're doing good. So I'm trying to get you to do something that I'm going to profit from or benefit from. That's not what Paul's doing. He's not going to personally profit from any of this. He's trying to motivate them and encourage them to follow through for not only their good, as we're going to see later, their benefit, but obviously the benefit of those on the receiving end. And so he's motivating them. But I think, all that to say that in terms of our first application idea here today would be simply this, that cheerful regifting inspires in others a generous heart. Cheerful regifting, because he's going to talk about giving joyfully and cheerfully. Cheerful regifting really inspires others to a generous heart. And I don't know if you've ever seen that to be true. I know I've heard from more than one person in this church who would tell me the story of saying, you're not going to believe what happened to me. I was in the drive-thru at Starbucks, and I ordered, and I got up to the window to pay, and the cashier says, well, the person ahead of you paid for your coffee. And I can see some of you now shaking your head, nodding your head. And the people go, like, wow, that's incredible. Like, are you kidding me? And so you're looking, trying to get a glance as they're driving away. Like, do I know them? Or how do they know me? Oh, man, did they see me? I hope I didn't look so bad. It's early in the morning. But, you're trying to figure it out. But usually you're so moved by that oftentimes, as I hear the story relayed, is that people are moved to say, you know what? What did the guy behind me order? Let me pay for that. And so, kind of following that movie that came out many years ago, that pay it forward idea. But I said, man, I want to give and pay for the person after me because it's kind of fun. And what Paul says is that when we give, when there's generosity, it inspires other people to generosity as well. I think that's the point he's trying to make first of all, that your zeal for giving influences it. His word stirs up the giving of others. Okay, that's the idea of influence or inspiring. But then we move on a little further in the passage, and he kind of gets into this idea of investment, and specifically return on investment. And he uses kind of some agrarian metaphor here about sowing and reaping. And, unless you grew up on the farm, and some of you did, and, you could give us a lot of insight here. But basically, I think there's a general rule that if you sow a little bit of seed, you can only really expect a little bit of crop. If you sow a lot of seed, chances are you can expect a return of a lot of crop. And that's kind of what he's alluding to. And let me read this to us again, and I want us to spend some time here. He says, the point is this, verse 6, whoever sows sparingly, which in this metaphor, that's representing giving. Whoever's sowing sparingly will reap sparingly. So whatever return there is on that is sparingly. And whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Now, let's stop right there. So the first idea of this return, and there's three characteristics here, is that the return is a proportionate. Okay, there's a proportion aspect to this idea. You sow little, you reap little. You sow a lot in abundance, you reap a lot in abundance. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about what are you talking about, Danny, about reaping? What is it that you actually reap and get back? Well, we'll get to that. But first, don't skip over this idea that there is kind of the spiritual law that God has put into effect. And we find it elsewhere described in Scripture, that which basically says you sow a lot, you reap a lot. You sow little, you reap little. That's the idea of proportion. Okay, let me show you Proverbs chapter 11. Verse 24 and 25 kind of captures this idea. It says, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Because, you tend to think it would be the other way, right? One who gives is going to have less. The one who withholds would have more. We see there's this spiritual principle at work that kind of challenges our faith. He goes on and says, whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. That's the idea here. So this return on the investment, first of all, is proportion. The second thing has to do with quality, the qualification of the return. So first idea really had to do with quantity, the quantity of your gift. The second has to do with quality. It speaks to how do you give it. And there's a right way and a wrong way. You may think, churches or organizations, charitable organizations that you give to, you may think that they don't care how you give it, just give it. Well, from God's point of view, that's not true. It is all about how you give it. It's all about your heart. In fact, look at what he says again. We're back and look at verse 7. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Now, this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. This is what we love about grace giving. It's not giving that is a response to the requirement of the law. It is grace giving based on the desire of your heart. And I love that. And so what he's saying here is that there is proportion, yes, but there's also a qualification. You got to do it the right way. And it's out of a heart. And notice what he says. It's out of a heart, first of all, not compulsion, not obligation, not reluctantly, but in contrast to that, cheerfully. The word for cheerful is the Greek word hilarion. It's where we get our word hilarious. It's like giving hilariously. It's like giving with laughter, giving with enjoyment. That is what he's talking about here. That's the kind of work that God's Spirit does in the heart of a believer that gives them great desire and enjoyment through giving. That is so beautiful, and it's such a contrast from obligation, requirement, compulsion, reluctant, that would leave people reluctant. In fact, I think that we can say very dogmatically from this passage that if you get to the point of your regular giving or love only, and you just feel primarily pressured. Like, Danny, you're talking about this for 4 weeks. We've got this in front of us. Like, man, okay. Like, I'm so tired. And you just kind of give and without joy, feeling more pressured. I would just say to you, do not give, because from God's point of view, it's just out of the flesh. It's not in a God-honoring way. God says that He loves a cheerful giver. Now, if you're like Kathy and me, there are times when you give and you're following through and you're excited about that. You're really jazzed about it. And times you think, oh man, what we could do if we weren't doing it. And you kind of wrestle a little bit, and then we kind of move up and down, and that's probably pretty normal. But if you never get to the idea of like, I'm so glad we're investing this money in the cause of Christ. If you never get to the point where you're freely and joyfully, I would say hold back. What we see in this passage, though, and I'm at risk of getting ahead a little bit, but that God says, for the man or the woman or the child who has a willingness and a desire, God says that He supplies the grace that provides both an opportunity and ability to give, if that's your heart's desire. That's the good news in the passage. However, there's a right way and a wrong way. If you can't get to the right way, probably better that you just not. God loves a cheerful giver. The third thing I want to point out from this passage here about the investment, this return on the investment, there's a proportion aspect to it. There's a qualification. And then third, I think most important here is the identification. What is the return, Danny? What is the nature of the return? Okay, so as we learned last week, that there is a camp called prosperity theology that would typically say that what God has in mind here is materially. So if you give your Rolex and you get back a Rolls Royce, you give your 100, you can expect God to give you 1,000. The idea that you're going to personally profit materially or financially off of this idea. This is not what he's saying. In fact, what he is saying is that there is a harvest, would be the return in this agricultural metaphor. He says, there is a harvest. Let's look at what it is. He says, first of all, the first hint we get is in verse 8. And God's able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. And so part of what's going on here in terms of their this identification is that there is the grace of God to be able to live this life of good work, of being generous. And then he's going to talk about the righteousness. He quotes from the Old Testament here. He says, he has distributed freely, he has given to the poor. And then what? His righteousness endures forever. That part of what he's saying, that you reap from a life of generosity, what you reap is a quality of life, a righteous life, a godly life. Notice how he comes back to it in verse 10. He says, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing. And what? And increase the harvest of your righteousness. That's what he's saying. He said, so, the big idea here is that cheerful regifting is an investment returning a godly harvest. Returning a godly harvest. Ladies and gentlemen, part of what you receive in return to your giving is the idea of a quality of life, of a satisfaction of a life well lived. You receive this experience of a wonderful life. It's that time of year where, everybody kind of gets together, and many of you have the tradition that, hey, you're going to sit around and watch It's a Wonderful Life. Watch that movie again. And, Jimmy Stewart playing George Bailey, and you remember the storyline. George Bailey lives in this small town, and he runs this, building and loan company, and he's an incredible guy, and he's always kind of lived with a little bit of resentment, though, because he dreamed of getting out of the small town, and he wanted to live a big life. He wanted to travel. He wanted to build things, the airports and bridges, and like he just envisioned his life in a much bigger way. That was kind of, his kind of self-vision for what he wanted life to be. But he made decisions along the way that kept him there, and motivated many times for wanting to better the life of his younger brother, the life of others in the community. And the movie opens up when he's in quite a bit of despair. His building and loan company was experiencing a cash flow issue. And the big monopolizer, evil man, Henry Potter in the town that wants to take over the town, he's threatening to shut down the building and loan company because of this missing cash, and it's bad. And George gets to the point where he says, this isn't the life I wanted, and now I'm at risk of losing everything, and he's going to take his life. Of course, heaven is watching. And Clarence, the angel, is sent down to help George, and George is at the point of saying, I just wish I'd never been born, and Clarence is going to grant his wish. And he's going to show George what life would have been like if he had never been born. You remember this. First thing George discovers is that if he hadn't been born, his brother Harry would have died. Because when Harry was young, he fell through the ice into the lake. And if George wasn't there to rescue him, he would have died. In fact, first thing he discovers is that his brother is dead. Second thing he discovers is that old man Groover, if I'm remembering his name right, the pharmacist that George had worked for in high school. He would have spent 20 years in prison. You may recall that George basically discovers the fact that this pharmacist was about to make a mistake and giving a prescription that would have resulted in the death of a child. And this pharmacist was distressed because of learning about his own son's death. And George stepped in and intervened to save him from that huge, huge mistake. But when he looks at life as if he had never been born, he finds out that pharmacist actually carried through, was not hindered, and the child died and he went to prison. It goes on revealing other things. For example, George kind of made affordable housing available for people. There was a subdivision named after him, the Bailey Park. And he made it possible for people, in his community to do well. But without him, the monopolizer, Henry Potter, named the town Pottersville. And the whole town took on his personality of his avarice and his vice. It was bad. And basically, George gets to the point where he hates what life has become for people with his absence. And so he kind of develops a whole new perspective. And so he kind of enters back into normal and real life and makes his way to his house where his wife has gathered all the friends and family who have been impacted by George's life of giving and selflessness and denial and all of his generosity. And they've gathered together. They've heard about some of the cash flow. They've brought money and they're celebrating his life. And basically, in this next picture, you see at the highlight of that Harry, his brother whom he had saved, who went on to save the lives of others in battle, that this one stands up and he says a toast to my older brother Harry. My older brother George, the richest man in town. Now, the whole issue had been that he was far from rich. But what he learns at the end of this idea is that he's the richest man in town in terms of quality of life, in terms of a life well lived, a meaningful life, a life given away for the benefit of others. And I tell you, as you think about making a gift to Olav only, as you think about just giving to whatever place God lays on your heart, whatever it is, when you think about living a life like that, what results, the return on that investment, not only is a reward in heaven, but right now is a meaningful life, a life well lived, a wonderful life. And that's what Paul is saying, that you reap what you sow. And it's not just a material thing. Rarely is it a material thing. It is the spiritual, relational riches that come from a life of generosity. And having made that point, he's going to finish up our passage today with making one other observation that I would just call about inventory. From what resources do we have to actually make a generous gift? So he addresses this with the Corinthians, and we pick up with verse 10. He said, "He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way." Let me stop right there. Basically, what we learn here is that God provides the inventory. The first thing is, we're just picking up from verse 8 again, is this idea of sufficiency of grace. That God says, if a person has the heart and willingness to want to give, what he says is that God gives you sufficiency, which I think here has the idea of contentment, that I'm good with living on less. I'm going to live on the balance of what I'm giving away. And so God gives grace to have sufficiency, the sense that I'm okay with that. Like I can get by with that. The other way that grace is used here is the idea that God giving not only the desire, but the opportunity and the ability to give. So that's the first idea, this sufficiency of grace. And then as I just read, the second is that God actually supplies the giving itself. Now that should be good news to all of us who want to make a gift, who feel like, I don't know what I have that I could possibly give. God says that if you're willing to give, He'll give the opportunity and the ability. Now, if you don't believe that, how do you take these verses? He who supplies the seed. The seed here, remember, is a picture of your gift, your financial gift. He who supplies the seed for the sowing and the bread for food. What he's saying is that he supplies the money for giving and the money for living. He provides what you're going to give, and He provides what you need to live, your bread for food. That He, the one who supplies that, will multiply your seed for sowing. In other words, He says, God says, you're generous and you're giving, like I'm going to take that and multiply that, not so it comes back for your, consumption or, for more buying. The idea here is that God provides more seed for sowing when He finds a generous heart. When He finds someone who gives, He says, I'll multiply that seed that you've sown into more seed that you can continue to sow. And I will increase the harvest of your righteousness. And so we see here that regarding inventory, there's a sufficiency of grace and there's a supply of gifts. The application I would just make here is that cheerful regifting has an inventory supplied by God's hand. It has an inventory that's supplied by God's hand. He provides it. Now, let me just try to imagine with you some ways that God provides seed for sowing. And I don't pretend to know all the ways, and I'm sure there's a billion ways, but here are a couple of ways that come to mind how God supplies seed for sowing. One way sometimes is that God puts on our heart simply the idea of reducing our expenses. Okay, so I know of several of you who, from Olive Only and some from way back with Life-Changing Harvest, that you just made the decision that we're not going to do cable TV anymore. So like we had the medium package or the full package, but we've just decided, we're going to put the rabbit ears back, and we're going to save that money and provide it for giving. I think that's incredible. Many of you have done that. You've cut expenses. Others of you have said, you know what, we're going to cut on the cafe. We're going to cut on going out to eat. So it's not completely, not entirely, but maybe we're going to cut back some and kind of reduce that part of our budget to free up money. Others of you have said, we're going to do without this or without that, that we're not going to do, the really nice big vacation for a few years, that we're going to, cut back. I mean, people have made a lot of different just lifestyle changes to free up money because their heart and desire was to give generously, and that God puts it in their heart to be creative about how to free up money for giving. I think that's incredible. That's all by the Spirit of God that people are open to when they have a heart that desires to give, not grudgingly. Another way I think that God sometimes helps us to give, those who want to give, is that He actually does increase your income. He gives you a promotion. He gives you a new job with more compensation. Sometimes there's something like that where you have an unexpected, unforeseen increase in income, and by doing so, God supplies seed for sowing. A third way sometimes that God may do that is He kind of puts on your heart a desire, and you begin exploring what would it look like to liquidate some of my assets that I have, that I might free up money, that I might make an investment. Those are just three ways. There's all kind of different ways that God may work and move and influence your thinking and desire that lead you to a supply of seed to sow. And that's what Paul is saying here. God's grace provides opportunity and ability for the heart that's open and desiring to give cheerfully and not reluctantly. That's the idea here. Cheerful regifting has an inventory supplied by God's hand. Well, I think it's been helpful to each week try to give you a picture of what some of this looks like. And today I just want to show you a video interview with John and Cindy Thomas, who kind of illustrates some of this as well.
Good morning, Hill Country Bible Church. My name is John Thomas, and this is my wife, Cindy. For the past 8 years, we have been members of Hill Country Bible Church. About 2 years ago, the elders put forth a plan to pay off the mortgage and get rid of our debt. We thought this was an excellent idea. It reflected wisdom and good stewardship. As they began to lay out the plan, it became apparent that those of us who were giving would be required to give on top of that. We knew that if we made this decision or commitment, that for the next 3 years, our spending habits would change quite a bit.
We knew there'd be some sacrifices, but this church is our home where our family and friends are.
Cindy and I began praying about what we could give. After several days of praying, we began discussing what God was leading us to give. And in God's providence, He placed upon our hearts the same amount. Mine may have been just a little bit bigger. This decision came at a difficult time for us. We had several children who were getting ready to leave home, and we knew there'd be some costs associated with that. We also had plans for retirement because we did not want to be a burden to our children. But we really wanted to be a help to our church. We are now 2 years into our 3-year commitment. I'm delighted to share with you that our children did transition into adulthood. We are saving towards our retirement, and throughout this entire time, we've been able to keep our commitments to the church. Yes, there were some tough times. Sometimes a vacation turned into a staycation. And when things broke at the house, we learned to fix it ourselves versus calling somebody. But throughout this entire time, we never missed a meal, even though I could probably afford to miss 1 or 2 meals.
And me too.
I'm not touching that.
Good idea.
For Cindy and I, this Old Love Only campaign is our way to have a significant impact upon the church, as well as the church having an impact upon the city of Pflugerville. This is a legacy that we are very proud of, and with God's help, we will finish strong.
We're all in.